any yarn weight. Like I used a fingering weight yarn to knit one right here, and it worked just as well. And it's a really great way to use variegated yarn. You can see those drop stitches in there. It's just really nice, great pattern, great for any weight of yarn. Hey nerdy knitters, we've been discussing budgeting and saving money on knitting this month. We have chatted about your favorite tips for saving money on knitting and yarn and patterns and all of those things. And we've also discussed how to reclaim yarn from sweaters that you no longer wear. And the same goes for any other things that you might have that you've knit and you no longer use. You can unravel them and use that yarn again. And we're tackling another topic today, free shawl patterns. I asked about your favorite free patterns and I chose the ones about shawls, and then I added some of my own, and you'll want to stick around because at the end I'm going to share the first shawl pattern I ever knit and a brand new shawl design that's just been released that you can knit for yourself. And best of all, they're all free. Now the first shawl on our shawl knitting patterns list is the Fankle shawl by Amanda Shuttermonkey, and this one's a recommendation from a viewer like you. It's our first cable knitting project, and she really recommends this pattern. Now this is a top-down triangle shawl. If you're not familiar with that construction, it starts right at the center neckline, and you work increases, 1 at each edge and then 2 along that center spine, and that creates this shawl body in this shawl shape. And then along with those yarn overs or whatever increases are used to create the shape, sometimes you've got stitch patterns in there. And in this Fankle shawl, we've got lots of cables and texture, and they seem to grow right out of that central spine. And I really like how the cables extend and they intertwine along that border. I think that's really pretty. I would classify this as something for an advanced beginner to an intermediate knitter. If you want to tackle cable knitting, then this could be a first great project for you. And it uses an Aran weight yarn, so you're not going to be working those cables on tiny little fingering weight yarn and tiny needles. You'll have bulkier yarn and larger needles, so you'll really be able to see what you're doing. Next on the list is the Summerlee shawl. It's a design that I've done for Knitty. You can see it right here on the mannequin. This is a crescent shawl, but it's knit from tip to tip. You work on the right tip first, and you increase along one edge, and you add a lace edging while you're working that. There's a bit of texture on the body. Then when you've reached about half the wingspan that you want, you start decreasing and working down to the left edge. So it's a really fun construction method, especially when you want to do like a pretty lace border that runs sort of right along one edge at the same time. And I would say this is good for an advanced beginner to intermediate knitter. It uses just 1 skein of fingering weight yarn, so it's more like a shawlette. It's a bit smaller, but it's a great 1 skein project. Now, a great beginner shawl is the Boneyard shawl by Stephen West. I think it's actually the very first thing he ever designed and released as a pattern. And it's also a top-down triangle shawl, but it's really very simple. It's just stockinette and garter ridges, and just a great way to learn the construction method for a triangle shawl. And it's finished with a wide band of garter stitch along the border. And then there are 2 options for increases. You can use open yarn overs, or you can use closed make one increases. There's also 2 options for the bind off. You can do just a simple bind off or an I-cord bind off. So this is a great beginner pattern, and it's also in 2 different yarn weights, fingering and DK weight. Next is the Close to You shawl by Justyna Lorkowska. Now this one has a lace edging that's worked on one edge, and it's worked from side to side, but this time it's an asymmetrical triangle shawl shape. Now this is a really fun shawl shape. You are working increases at one edge and a decrease at the other, and that creates this asymmetrical shape because you're sort of removing a stitch from one side but adding it to the other. It's kind of hard to explain, but I do have a video that walks through this method. And in her design, it's done in garter stitch. And then she has this interesting edging that's worked along one side at the same time. While you're knitting the shawl body, you also have this really pretty edging. And then it's finished with a picot bind off. And it's reversible because it's all in garter stitch. Now this would be a great pattern for variegated yarn. You've got the garter stitch and that lace edging. It just would look really nice. So this would be great for an advanced beginner. It's another one of those 1 skein fingering weight projects, but would definitely be easy to adjust if you have more yarn. Next is another recommendation from a viewer, Claire's Outlander shawl from Handy Little Me. Now I wasn't quite sure which shawl she meant because Handy Little Me is the go-to resource for Outlander inspired knits. Of course there are a few books as well, But if you really want to look at a lot of great patterns inspired by the TV show or replicas from the TV show, then Handy Little Me's website is a great place to look. And there are lots of great shawl patterns. Now, the designer is Louise Balanos, and this is her website. And if you like the Outlander knits, then this is definitely a place you want to check out. There's lots of shawls, there's fingerless mitts, there's sweaters, there's hats. There's really a lot to explore on her website. Now the next one is really interesting. It's the Half and Half Triangle Shawl by Jake Canton for Pearl Soho. This takes the triangle shawl shape but really changes it up. It's garter stitch, and you're using short rows to give you this really interesting construction method. So really basic stitch pattern, but you're working one triangle first using short rows to create the triangle shape. And then you change colors and you're working short rows again to work the other triangle. And then you fold it over, and so it's like a double layer triangle shawl, but really interesting way to get that shawl shape. Now this one's great for an advanced beginner to an intermediate knitter, somebody who wants to try short rows and an interesting construction method. And this one uses fingering weight yarn in 2 colors. And then Lori recommends the Easy Goes It shawl from Finicky Creations. Now this is another of those asymmetrical triangle shapes. You're working a double increase at one edge and a decrease at the other edge. So you're always increasing, but you're also sort of offsetting the stitch pattern, so you get that asymmetrical shape. Now for stitch patterns, it's just garter stitch, there's some stockinette stitch, there's some eyelet mesh. This is another one of those great patterns that for variegated yarns, all the different stitch patterns are a great way to show off those colorful yarn designs. And this would be great for a beginner to an advanced beginner, and it uses 1 skein of fingering weight yarn, so it's a great way to use up some stash yarn as well. Next is Campside by Alicia Plummer, and this is another top-down triangle shawl. So we know how the construction method works at this point, and this one uses really easy stitch patterns. There's stockinette stitch, and then there's eyelets, and then you gradually space the eyelets further or closer and closer together as the shawl grows. And then you've got some ribbing that sort of looks like a ruffle along the border. I really like how when you do these wide sections of rib, it sort of looks like a ruffle in a shawl like this. This would be great for a beginner to an advanced beginner knitter, and it uses a DK weight yarn. And then we have another side-to-side crescent shawl, Estuary by Tin Can Knits. Now this is an all-over lace design. Now it's only charted, there are no written instructions, but they do include instructions for changing yarn weights or the size of the pattern. And you are going to be working some multiple charts at once here, but the design is very, very pretty. So this is probably suitable for an intermediate knitter, somebody who wants to tackle that couple charts at the same time and they really like lace. This one uses 2 skeins of fingering weight yarn. Now we still have more patterns to look at, but if you're enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you'd give it a thumbs up. And if you have any free shawl pattern recommendations, be sure to leave a comment and share them with us. Now next on the list is Clapotis by Kate Gilbert. This is another design for Knitty, and I know it was very popular a few years ago with good reason. This is another of those great patterns for variegated yarns because it has dropped stitches, and that really highlights the different colors and the variegation in a yarn. So this one is a bias rectangle shawl. You start at one point and you increase at both sides, sort of like you're working one of those heirloom or grandma's favorite dishcloths. But then when it's as wide as you want, you increase on one edge and you decrease on the other, and that continues that bias shaping. Then when it's as long as you want, you decrease at both edges down to the other point. Now this one, it's just stockinette stitch, but it includes sections of dropped stitches, which can be really fun to just see those stitches drop down. And it's very simple to adjust the size of this as well. So really, if you want to just clean out your stash and use some stash yarn, you could make it as small or as large as you like. Be great for an advanced beginner to an intermediate knitter. It uses an Aran weight yarn, but really, it's really easy to adjust the pattern to any yarn weight. Like I used a fingering weight yarn to knit one right here, and it worked just as well. And it's a really great way to use variegated yarn. You can see those dropped stitches in there. It's just really nice, great pattern, great for any weight of yarn. Then there's Vanderlynn by Taiga Hilliard. Now this is another recommended designer, Kristen really likes her patterns, especially her snug bug cardigan. So I went and checked out her shawls to see if she had any, and she has some. So Vanderlynn was one that I really liked. And this one uses that side-to-side triangle, but this one uses a double decrease in the center and then increases at both edges, and then you get sort of this kite-shaped shawl. This is a really fun construction method, and it's basic stitch patterns. You've got some garter stitch going on, there's some drop stitches, there's some twisted stitches, there's some slipped stitches, there's eyelets, there's lace. So if you like lots of variety in your shawl, then this could be a really good choice. And it would also be a good way to use up some leftover stash. You could use one main color for the garter stitch, and then different leftover bits for each of the textured or lace sections. So this would be great for an advanced beginner or an intermediate knitter. And it uses 2 colors of fingering weight yarn, but of course you could change the number of colors that you use. Then there's Bojagi by Knit Boop Designs. This is another of those asymmetrical triangle shawls. So it's got 2 increases at one edge and a decrease at the other, and you get that asymmetrical triangle shape. Now this one uses some garter stitch, then it's got a little bit of slip stitch knitting in there with 2 different colors, but that's a great way to do some color work knitting because you're only ever using one color at a time. You don't have to hold 2 strands at once. Then we also have a lace section in there. So this one would be fine for an advanced beginner. It uses 2 colors of fingering weight yarn. Now another one of my favorite free patterns is Spindrift by Helen Stewart. You can get that one for free by signing up for her email list. And it's a top-down crescent shawl. Now a top-down crescent is very similar to a top-down triangle shawl. You start at that center neck at the top and you're working your increases, but instead of increases spaced evenly, they are worked just at the edges. You might work 4 increases, you might work 6 increases. This one uses 6 to get the long curly wingspan. And it's just basic stockinette, the garter edging, and then there's sections of eyelet ridges and a picot bind off. But it's a great pattern. It's really easy to follow, and she uses a table format that helps you keep track of where you're at in the pattern. So this would be great for a beginner to an advanced beginner, and it uses just 1 skein of fingering weight yarn. Next on the list is another of my designs, the Color Adventure Shawl. You can find this for free on Knitty, and it's intended to be done with a skein of yarn that has really long color changes. And it's a top-down triangle shawl as well, and every time you change the colors, you change the stitch pattern as well. So you alternate between sections of stockinette stitch, garter stitch, a really simple textured pattern, and then a section of eyelet mesh as well. And they're all really simple stitch patterns, just 2 row repeats. Then you have 1 final larger section, and this one uses about 1 100-gram skein of yarn if you were going to use your own stash yarn or something like that. And then we have eyelet ridges and another simple textured pattern, and then a picot bind off. So this would be just fine for a beginner to an advanced beginner knitter, and it uses fingering weight yarn, about 160 grams. And then the last shawl on my list is the first shawl that I ever knit. It's the Grain pattern by Tin Can Knits. Oh, that's the wrong side. There's the right side. Now theirs uses 4 colors, but it's really simple to change colors and really customize it the way that you want to. It's a really great first top-down triangle shawl. Theirs also includes tutorials on their website for the different ways to start the shawl and 3 different yarn weights. So it's just easy to knit and adjust the size depending on the amount of yarn you have. And it's just garter stitch and yarn overs. It couldn't be simpler. It's a great beginner level pattern for those who want to knit their first top-down triangle shawl. Now I know there are plenty of free shawl knitting patterns available, and I would love to know which ones are your favorites. So leave a comment telling me about your favorite shawl knitting patterns, those free ones especially. And if we get enough of them, we could always do another video with your recommendations. And if you're looking for more shawl knitting patterns, I've put together a short playlist with even more great patterns that you'll want to check out. So click right here and I'll see you in the next video.